Moving on to the part of the test review where we're talking about domain restrictions for the 6 inverse trig functions, and then we have these 6 problems that we're asked to evaluate. All right, so let's do the domain restrictions first. You need to make sure that you know which quadrants you can pull from for your inverse trig functions. So remember that there are 2 options. There are some of the inverse functions that are restricted to between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. And so these are the sine inverse, the tangent inverse, and the cosecant inverse. Now, also keep in mind that when we talk about negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2, that is quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. And remember that we have quadrant 1 for the positives and quadrant 4 for the negatives. All right, the other set of restrictions runs from 0 to pi. And that set of domain restrictions apply for the cosine inverse, the secant inverse, and the cotangent inverse. And remember, saying 0 to pi really means that we're saying quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. Quadrant 1 for the positives, quadrant 2 for the negatives. So those are the domain restrictions for each of the 6 inverse trig functions. All right, so let's look at using those and see if we can answer these 6 questions. Your success on this type of question really depends on how well you know your memorized values. All right, so I'm going to start with the first one, which says that we want the inverse sine of negative 1. Remember that what this is asking for is it's asking for an angle where sine is equal to negative 1. Now, that is not a memorized value for me. It is not something that I've memorized for the sine function, so therefore I know that it must come off of the graph. So this is where you being able to draw a sine graph very quickly will help you answer a question. All right, so here is my sine graph. Remember that I'm looking for a place where the sine graph is equal to negative 1. So that's happening down here. And then the only thing you need to ask yourself is, what is this point? So that point is 3 pi over 2. Okay, but the problem with me saying that is that that is outside of my restriction. Remember, on a sine, we are limited between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. So in order to get a similar point, I need to extend my sine graph back in this direction. All right, remember that this point is negative pi over 2, and it is also a place where the sine graph is equal to negative 1. We need to stay inside of our domain restriction. All right, so the answer on this one should be negative pi over 2. You cannot answer it 3 pi over 2. And I realize that technically those are referring to the same angle on your circle, but you have to stay inside the domain restriction. So it has to be written as negative pi over 2. It also needs to be written in radians. You cannot write these in terms of degree measurements for what our purpose is in working these problems. Okay, you will be asked on the test to write your answers in radians. All right, so let's move on to the next one, secant inverse of negative 2. All right, so I need to find an angle where secant is equal to negative 2. That angle needs to be, and I'm looking over here, that angle needs to be in either quadrant 1 or 2, but because it's negative, it needs to be in quadrant 2. Okay, so I'm going to think then about what I know about secant. So what I know is that secant at pi over 3 is equal to positive 2. Okay, that is my memorized value. So now all I need to do is to take that pi over 3 angle which is here, and flip it over into the second quadrant. So mirroring it over, my angle goes there, And then if I'm neat enough, I can tell that that particular angle is 2 pi over 3. Okay, and I can count it out. Remember, we count out over 6. So this is pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6. And 4 pi over 6 is going to reduce to 2 pi over 3. So that's my answer there. All right, so my next one. Cosecant inverse of square root of 2. So this is asking me to find an angle where the cosecant is equal to square root of 2. I know that I'm limited to quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Since it's positive, I want to be in quadrant 1. So this is just a matter of me getting my memorized value. I know that cosecant at pi over 4 is equal to the square root of 2. It's in the right quadrant, so I'm done. The next one, tangent inverse of -1. So I need an angle where tangent is equal to -1. All right, so again, I'm going to come back over here to what I wrote down for my domain restrictions. I'm going to find my tangent. I'm going to say to myself, tangent inverse is limited to quadrant 1 or 4. Because we are negative, we're going to be quadrant 4. So what do I know from a memorized value? I know that tangent of pi over 4 is equal to 1. But I need this angle to be in quadrant 4. So I'm going to draw it first in quadrant 1. I'm going to flip it down to quadrant 4. And remember that we're rotating down, so it's going to be negative pi over 4. And that will be my answer. All right, so my next one. My next one says that I need an angle where cosine is equal to negative square root of 3 over 2. So again, I'm going to look at my inverse cosine. I'm going to say to myself, I have to be in quadrant 1 or 2. Because this thing is negative, I need to be in quadrant 2. All right, what do I know as a memorized value? So I know that cosine at pi over 6 is equal to square root of 3 over 2. So let's draw it. Pi over 6 is going to be like right here. I need it to be in quadrant 2, so I'm going to flip it over here. And then I'm going to figure out what that angle is. And again, if you know your angles, you know that that's 5 pi over 6. If you don't, then you can count it out. You can say pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6. All right, and then our last one, we're looking for an angle where cotangent is equal to negative square root of 3 over 3. All right, so again, I'm going to look at my definition, at my restriction on the domain. I'm going to find the cotangent. We said quadrant 1 or 2. This is negative, so we're going to be quadrant 2. All right, so what do I know as a memorized value? I know that cotangent at pi over 3 is equal to square root of 3 over 3. So let's draw it. So I'm going to draw the pi over 3 angle. That's the angle in quadrant 1. I need it to be in quadrant 2, so I'm going to reflect it over. And now when we look at that angle, we can see that that is 2 pi over 3 for our answer. All right, again, count it out if you need to. pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6. This is 4 pi over 6, reduces to 2 pi over 3. Okay, so expect to have on your test a section like this where you are finding exact values. You need to be sure, first of all, that you remember that an inverse function is looking for an angle. So be sure you're giving me an angle as the answer. You also need to be sure that you know your restrictions. All right, if you are not sure on your restrictions, you are not going to know where that angle needs to go, and so you're going to end up with the wrong answer. So be sure you know your restrictions, be sure that you know that you're looking for an angle, and brush up on your memorized values.